Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to you all for a wonderful evening that's now, 2 weeks after we all heard the most marvelous piece of news that Paul Romer had been awarded the 2018 Nobel Prize in economics. 2 weeks since then, and we are still partying, we are still celebrating. If I have my way, we will continue celebrating at least until the next 2019 Nobel Prize is awarded. It's going to be a year of celebration, but much more importantly than that, it's a year of celebration of NYU, of celebration of the Stern School of Business, and of course Paul's role as the founding head of the Stern Urbanization project, which he began in 2011. And of course, it's very much a celebration of the NYU Marin Institute for Urban Management and the critical role that Paul played in the development of that institute. And we're celebrating so much tonight, but especially we're celebrating Paul Romer and the impact of his work, his scholarship, his research. It's research that all of you know well. It's research that takes, at least from my perspective, a very optimistic view of the world and the role of economies, and particularly the role that technology and knowledge generation can play in growth and in enhancing human wealth and prosperity. And so we have an opportunity now to hear from Paul in this very intimate setting. Now, I have one question for the Dean. Where is the roaring log fire that we were all promised in this fireside chat? But certainly fire safety precludes that coming forward. But before we move to Paul and Raghu in conversation, let me say we celebrate economics at NYU tonight as well. We celebrate an outstanding department of economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. We celebrate an outstanding group of economists here in NYU Stern School of Business. We celebrate the fact that Paul is the 6th NYU economist in the past 20 years to be celebrated and recognized by the Nobel Prize. And so there's much to enjoy this evening, especially the conversation of Raghu and Paul. But before we move to that, may I call on Bill Berkley, the chair of the NYU Board of Trustees. Bill, will you come and say a word?
Welcome to all of you. So Peter Henry called me up and said, there's this guy in California named Romer who we really need to get here. And I said, okay, what does he do? And he said, he studies cities. And he said, but he comes from California. Do they have cities? And Peter said, that's why we'll get him here. And Paul came in, and Peter and Paul and I sat down and talked. And it was a really interesting conversation because Paul was only half interested in being in New York, and he thought, well, maybe it'll be interesting. But he had so many interesting things to say. It was so exciting. And for those of you who may know Paul, he is not politically correct at all. But he is always direct to the point and never minces his words. But he's an extraordinary person, good, kind, thoughtful, but he's grounded in fact and truth. So I thought when we got him here that immediately upon him coming to New York, he would get a Nobel Prize right away for being so smart to come here. But in fact, I was disappointed that it didn't happen right away. And over the years, I've gotten to know Paul a bit. He's wonderful, more creative, more thoughtful than I ever dreamed. And he is a real addition to NYU, and it's been a wonderful thing to have him. So Paul, for all of us who've been around for many years, congratulations. Thank you so very much for being a part of our university and of the Stern School. We couldn't be prouder of what you've done, and we couldn't be happier that you're a part of what we do. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. I'm Clay Gillette. I'm the director of the Marin Institute of Urban Management. I've got some really large shoes to fill. I come from the law schools. Thank heavens there's no Nobel Prize in law. It takes all the pressure off. It's more than a privilege to be able to participate in this event, to recognize and celebrate the accomplishments of Paul Romer. We're all aware of Paul's contributions to the world of economics, but Paul has also been a visionary with respect to the role of the university in modern society, in effect questioning and advancing the very idea of the university. Paul has long advocated merging the theoretical and abstract insights of traditional academic research with real-world needs, a marriage to which he assigned the designation Pasteur's Quadrant. More specifically, he saw a function for the university in addressing the critical challenges of urban living. By wedding the academic to the practical, Paul believed that the university could work with cities to improve the opportunities available to urban residents, both here in New York City and around the globe. Paul believed that by assuming a role in applied work, NYU could not only make the world's cities more prosperous, safer, and more inclusive, but also could better position its scholars to understand how urban areas work. When Paul took on the director role at the Marin Institute back in 2013, he put his vision for applied work into practice. To this day, the Marin Institute remains dedicated to Paul's vision, working with cities and other jurisdictions to improve the delivery of public services and to effect positive social change. Paul's mantra that the work of the Marin Institute should be measured by the impact it has, not simply by its fiscal sustainability, remains the guidepost of the university, certainly of the university, but even more so of the Institute. I can think of no greater testament to Paul than to recognize how successful academics were willing to migrate to New York and to change the way they thought about their own roles, both in the universities and in society at large, in order both to work with Paul and to help implement his vision. So on behalf of the faculty, the research staff, and the administrative staff of the Marin Institute of Urban Management, it is my great pleasure to congratulate Paul on this tremendous achievement. Of course, Paul could only have implemented this vision with the generosity and wisdom of someone, a friend of the university, who was willing to gamble that Paul's ideas could be put into practice. Fortunately for all of us, Paul found that partner in Donald Marin, a life trustee of the university and the founding donor of the Marin Institute of Urban Management. So I am doubly honored in that I get to present Don, who will introduce Paul to you. Don, thanks for everything you've done.
Thank you very much. They worried about me, so they gave me what to say. I want to start out by saying that for me, getting involved with NYU has been an extraordinary experience. I really learned about it early from Marty Lipton and John Sexton, and then when I saw Bill Berkley and the young man who's running the place here, Andy Hamilton, I thought this is really a great place to be involved. And in the course of that, they came to me and said they wanted to start a school for the study of cities, and they asked me if I would lead it. By the way, that's code for saying finance it. But I also thought, as I thought about it, I'm very lucky. I grew up in New York City, didn't have so many things when I started, and I really owe the city a lot. And then along comes Paul, who gets a Nobel Prize for showing how economic growth and the discovery of new ideas leads to sustained improvements in human prosperity. And nowhere is that more apparent when you combine a distinguished research institute with a very vibrant city. And so that combination is really great. Now, keeping Paul was hard. He got this job, and we got to know each other. And then I had lunch with him one day, and I said, you know, this book I'm just reading called The 7 Principles of Physics. It's only 7 chapters on 7 things. The first one is on relativity. The second one is on something else, on and on. I said, I can kind of understand it, Paul, but for our next 7 lunches, can we start out with you explaining each chapter and all the math? He said, I would love to do it. By the end of the second chapter, he left to go with the World Bank. And I said, hey, Paul, what's happened to the rest of the chapters? Well, to his credit, when he got back, the first thing he said to me was, we'll do the other 5. Now, it hasn't happened yet, because our lunch last week was we talked about the Nobel Prize, and somehow that was more important, Paul, than the other 5 chapters of this book. We shared a big agreement on 2 important things. Cities are engines of innovation, economic prosperity and opportunity. It's a place where ideas both come and grow and flourish and are executed. And the second thing, universities in general, but research university at the level of NYU, combined with all of these things, can improve the life in the cities. And that's really what this Urban Institute is all about. What we can do to combine academics with the real world. Sorry, I shouldn't put that word, yes, but academics with the commercial world, in order to provide a better life for everybody. And we're doing it. We're working with the MTA to improve bus service in Brooklyn. I'm not sure it's worked yet, but I'm told it's working away. Tackling air pollution in Mexico City, the growth in Ethiopia's cities, which is the place that you're in. I don't even know where Ethiopia is, but I'm sure we're doing a good job helping them. And what's really interesting, working in criminal defense and things with correction departments. And I want to show you what an impact this has made on the family. Angela, where is Angela? She is a brilliant star professor that we got from California. Invited my wife, who's a super accomplished person, 5 great careers, to go with her to the one place you probably would really not want to go, Sing Sing. She came home one night and said, I'm going to Sing Sing. I said, what did you do, dear? So they went to Sing Sing and came back, and she was very impressed with what was going on there, and very, very impressed with Angela as a very good example of the talent that we have. Well, all that, what I want to do is say, Paul Romer's an extraordinary person. He's a man of thought, of action, of sensitivity, of caring. He has all the elements of a great man, now crowned by the Nobel Committee, which we knew that all along before, Paul, so congratulations. So I introduce Paul Romer, and I also introduced the Dean of the Leonard N. Stern School, Sundaram. Dean, I'm very nice to meet you, and we look forward to whatever's going to happen from here. Okay.
Thank you, Don, and good evening, everybody. So, Paul is everything that the speakers who came before said, but he's also I think they touched upon this, he's also had an incredibly interesting career that's taken unusual paths. We'll explore all of that in the conversation to come. But first, I think there's only one other person I recognize in this room who would know what it feels like to win a Nobel Prize. So how has your life changed in the last 2 weeks?
If I may, let me just go back and fill in one detail, because I think there's a nice story about, so what were the incentives and kind of compensation I got for working with Don on the Marin Institute. And the single most important thing was that Don really kind of steeled up his courage and was nervous about this, but finally said to me, Paul, could I introduce you to a friend of Katie's, his wife? And I thought, okay, well, sure. And Don and Katie were worried because we went to a restaurant. It was very noisy. It was a little hard to hear. But the woman he introduced me to and I hit it off just instantly. One of the funny parts of the story is she was dating somebody very kind of important in New York City and very wealthy. And she asked a friend. She'd learned where I live, where I have a house. And she asked a friend, what should I do? And the friend said, go with the real estate. So through Don and NYU, I'm now part of a partnership with the love of my life. Then when I went to the World Bank on leave, there was this kind of conversation which went like, well, while I'm on leave, can I keep the house? And can I keep the girlfriend? And the part she likes is the order there. So we're New Yorkers, you know, and you got to ask about the real estate. But Don, it was really a wonderful, unexpected side benefit of the friendship with Don and his wife, Katie. Okay, so on to more serious matters.
The question, what does it feel like to be a Nobel laureate? I think everyone in this room would like to know that. How's your life changed?
Yeah. Well, I have to reassure you that there's a kind of a buffer at home if you're worried. In my press conference, I said something about, well, economists, if we're going to be the umpires of the fact business, we can't take the field and score a goal. And I got home and Caroline said, Paul, you don't have umpires in soccer. And we have 4 dogs, and there are times when she's extremely good writer. She published a book this year, but that you should all read called Proust's Duchess. We have 4 dogs, and sometimes she has to speak to me the way she speaks to the dogs. It's like, Paul, put that metaphor down. And you can see why I get in trouble with metaphors. So, but anyway, so she helps keep me a little bit grounded. You know, there was a reporter who said to me, I was talking on the phone, and he said, "You're so young to get the Nobel Prize." I said, "Wait a minute, are we on the record? Can I quote you?" And he said, "Yeah." So I yelled up, you know, "This reporter says I'm really young." After the phone call is done, Caroline came down and said, "Paul, now we're going to have to talk about flattery and how people will manipulate you." And so anyway, you know, there's a checks and balances. There's also this funny feeling that, you know, I'm the same person, but yet a lot of things are suddenly different. And I think somebody else said, "Paul, you have a new first name. It's Nobel laureate Paul Romer." Mm-hmm. So those first names, Nobel laureate, those are not really me. Those mean I've got a new role, and so there's things that come with that role, and I'm mindful of those. But and it's important to keep track of what those are. I mean, those responsibilities are about this broader endeavor, the science and the discovery. The prize. So who knows? Oh, Don, actually, do you know what Einstein got? Oh, I probably told you this. What Einstein got the Nobel Prize for? It wasn't relativity. You know, this amazing discovery, mm-hmm. because the prize has this restriction that it has to be for practical advantages, and they weren't sure if relativity would turn out to ever have any practical utility. It turns out that relativistic clock corrections are part of what makes GPS work, mm-hmm. so it now is very practical. But the photoelectric effect was his other discovery that they gave. And so the prize from Nobel emphasized this notion of practice that is like, and I can't remember who attributed Pasteur's quadrant to me, but I didn't. Oh, it was Clay. I didn't invent that. Was actually a dean at Princeton. But well, okay. But it is, I think, a really important insight, and it was a unique feature of the U.S. university with the Land Grant Act, the Morrill Act that created the Land Grant University. So I think there's still lots of room for us to push the margins and adapt this very productive institution, which is part of this really noble endeavor, and keep using it to make progress going forward. So I've got a new role, but I'm the same guy I was 3 weeks ago. Okay,
then let me ask you this question. Bill spoke about your candor, which I've always found very refreshing.
Yeah.
Is Nobel laureate Paul Romer watching his words a little more carefully than Professor Paul Romer?
I'm trying, and I've got good advice at home. So no, you have to take the role involves some responsibilities, mm-hmm. and yeah.
So on to the prize itself. The Academy cited your contributions, and I'm quoting, for integrating technological innovations into long-run macroeconomic analysis. Mm. If you had to summarize the most important insights of your research from that period, the 80s, and how it changed economics for a general audience, how would you express it?
Yeah. So one way that I would try and say it for a general audience is to emphasize the importance of imagination. It's very easy to get caught up in an implicit model that the world is the way it is because that's the only way it could be, and it really can't be very different. And I think the reality is just completely the opposite. If you look forward, there's just all kinds of possibilities, all kinds of things we couldn't possibly have discovered yet. And so that has a kind of, I think, this optimistic and kind of empowering sort of vision about what the future will be is something that we'll decide, we'll make it. It has another effect that I think is a little bit less comfortable and that makes it a little harder to really take on board, because if where we're going to end up is the effect of just innumerable decisions and choices that could go at every level in a different direction. What that means is where we've arrived at has no real rhyme or reason. It's just, it's just one damn thing after another, and here we are. And so the wide open possibilities also means that it's hard to kind of get the kind of meaning about, well, the world is just the way it should be, it's the way it has to be, it's the way it's always been. It's like, well, no, the world just is a bunch of things and people did it. But I think the real message of all of this is we should be mindful of the possibilities, and we should use imagination to think about the things that we don't yet know, we haven't yet seen, but that could be. And if we do that and arrange our institutions and our laws and our systems to keep allowing some of those imagined possibilities to be realized, then we'll keep this amazing story of human progress going for as far into the future as you can imagine. I was a physics major and as an undergrad, and my son, who's kind of into science fiction, I used to have this argument. He thinks that humans will get out of the solar system when the sun blows up in like 13 billion years. I think we're toast after 13 billion years. So, the long run has a cap T on it. But, for the next several billion years, I think it could be a great ride.
So talking of those possibilities, and you talked about progress and possibilities, in the later phase of your research, you emphasized urbanization. Don mentioned this, Clay mentioned this. Urbanization as the fundamental engine of economic growth and as the strategy that developing countries should follow as part of the catch-up growth. Now, what led you to this thought process, and can you talk us through the whole idea?
One of the problems with memory is that you can construct stories, and unless you go back and really check the facts, you can sometimes get it wrong. So this is a little bit of a fable, I guess, and we'd have to cross-check it against the actual steps. But because of an initiative at USAID, it was organized by Angus Deaton, who's another Nobel Prize winner. There were a group of us as academics who were brought into AID to raise some new ideas. And Angus remembers well, and I remember well too, Angus's reaction, because I wrote a short paper and gave a presentation about building a Hong Kong for Africa, saying, look, Hong Kong has actually been very, has had some good side effects in China, and should we do that in Africa? Angus, if you know Angus, he's Scottish. Angus let me know exactly what he thought about the optics and the appearance of this suggestion, but somehow out of that, but he remembered it, and it's been fun to stay in touch with him. But somehow out of that, I just got thinking more and more about, well, so why did Hong Kong work, and what's generalizable about it? I was very influenced by. Well, this is actually after I came to NYU, but by visiting Shenzhen when I was at Shanghai. Shenzhen is just this amazing story. If Shenzhen were a city-state, it has the fastest growth rate of, just beats Singapore and Hong Kong hands down. And there were other colleagues, including my thesis advisor, Ed Glazer, who many of you know, who were taking these same notions about ideas and applying them to cities. And because of those abstract ideas and then the experience in some of these city-states, my sense was we could really take seriously what Ed Glaser says, which is cities make us smart. And we need to let everybody have a chance. And here then I just borrow, so I just stole from Ed and then I stole from Solly. And Solly says, we just have to make room for the people who want to go to cities because they want the chance to learn. And so it was that kind of hunch that led me to, I guess the other thing, there was an analogy that I was struck by when I was thinking about science policy, which was the development of chemical engineering as a whole new school. It was MIT and Purdue, but also as a kind of a profession and a set of principles for organizing these complex processes and converting them from the lab environment into factories. So I was asking, what's the new thing that we should have in universities? What have we invented recently? And computer science is a real success story here that came really from the Defense Department. But I was thinking there may be this opportunity to do something in urbanization. And the bet I made was that at some points in your career, if part of what you want is to make things happen, the way Solly describes it is, our output was stakes in the ground. We don't write reports, we don't write papers, or we do, it's kind of just a sideline, that this program makes a difference if we put stakes in the ground. And if you want to make an environment where that can happen, part of what you do is you create a kind of a structure like the Institute. And I always said my job was just to provide air cover. And it was people like Solly and Angela that we could recruit who came in and really, took the lead in doing these amazing things. And is Patrick here? He's not. Okay. Well, then nobody will contradict me. I'm pretty sure it was. I'm pretty sure it was Hwassa in Ethiopia, not Bahir Dar. But in Hwassa, there's like 60,000 people who've moved in and are working in jobs in brand new factories doing mostly garment assembly. Partly because of the work that Solly's team did to just lay out a grid of streets and just say to everyone, in case we need them, we know where the streets are. There's private land. If you want to come in and build factories, you can do it. But what the streets, the public space do for you is give you the backbone for the connectivity that you'll add as the city grows. And if that learning is about taking advantage of connectivity, if you don't get that two-dimensional grid that's every pipe, every wire, every package, every person's going to be moving along, you won't get the same kind of interaction that you could get later. And it was so wonderful to move to New York because Bill doesn't tell the full story. I loved Palo Alto. I like mountain biking. I thought New York is going to suck, but it actually turned out I loved it when I got here. And it really is the model for the whole world. The 1811 plan that laid out the grid of public space in the city was just essential for the density that we now have. Alain, who's here, taught me, just look at the blocks in Midtown, measure the dimensions, you'll see that about 33% of the land in Midtown is devoted to this grid for connectivity. It's a lot of land. But because it's there, we get all this interaction that makes all these good things possible. So I could kind of provide, with Don's help, kind of like the cover, the air cover, and then we could recruit people like Solly, Alain, Angela, and the whole team. And it's really gratifying to go out and see. In Hwassa, you can go out and see where, as soon as they've decided where a road might go, they just go cut the trees down, and so you've got a visible sign of it. In Colombia, we funded a nursery. And we're trying to then get children to go out and plant trees along the arterial road network that's being laid out just in these fields around the cities. So it's very gratifying to see that, and it's kind of fun to have a role where it's not, these were not my ideas about urbanization, but to have a hunch about where the big picture might be and to provide an environment where then other people can go do it, and to show the value of this stakes in the ground, confrontation with reality sort of approach. It's really been a great opportunity. I think Angela has probably run more RCTs inside prisons than anybody in the United States. I think you may have run more than everybody combined, everybody else. Do you know what number you're up, like? I mean, hundreds of RCTs. I mean, and this is just small differences in things you do in prisons that might, for example, reduce the use of what they call segregation, which really is the solitary confinement. And if you give the people in the prisons the chance to actually run these experiments and learn from them, they can come up with discoveries that can reduce it in a given prison. And so it's a different mode of doing research. You're kind of empowering others, but it's the tool which then unleashes a lot of benefits. So that's the kind of the recent trajectory that I'm really so pleased about.
So we'll get back to the trajectory in a second. By the way, I think by RCTs you mean randomized controlled trials,
I'm sorry,
right?
yes.
For
Yeah.
those. Okay. So, but I did want to ask you one thing. At the beginning of the last thing, you said we'll have to do some fact checking.
Yes.
And I'm going to bring you back to an issue that you've expressed strong opinions on. How do we? Theory provides us a framework for understanding data, but data is very important to validate theories and understand the world.
Yep.
How do we get policymakers to pay attention to theory and to facts in formulating policies far more than is being done now?
Yeah. Well, one thing, it's really slightly off topic, but I do emphasize a lot, is that the main function of theory is to help us imagine new possibilities. Like, it's logically consistent if the following thing happens. So it could happen, and it should broaden our sense of the possibilities, and that's what, like, the growth theory did. But you never know what actually happens. Like math, logic, theory, that never proves anything. Like, a fact always trumps the theory and the logic, and you know what is actually possible, what's there now, what could be there by trying it. So the facts are just the things that ultimately rule in this business. Look, the track record of science, I mean, it's frustrating, it's slow, it's, kind of one step forward, one step back, and two steps forward. But if you look at just the last couple hundred years, the effect that science has had on our lives, I mean, how much longer we live, all the things we have access to, it works pretty well. So as frustrating as it is, we just, in some ways, we ought to just understand and preserve what's working. And then the other thing that I've become more mindful of is when I went to the World Bank, it was just after the Brexit vote. And I interpreted the Brexit vote as, at least in part, a bunch of people who said, if the economists are for it, we're against it. And the economists' reaction was, well, then the people are wrong. To which I always say, well, we believe in democracy, right? So you can't just say that, they're wrong. And I think it was a sign that economists had really overstepped. We hadn't been careful about separating. We have expertise about some statements about, here are the facts, and here's some conjectures about, if you do X, then you'll see Y. But we can't tell you what a society should do. We can't tell you what's right. And there's a different process that people use to resolve that. And by sometimes being a little incautious about saying, well, if X, then Y means you should do X, I think we undermined our legitimacy a little bit. So one of the obvious, easy strategies in this is just be rigorous and disciplined with ourselves about, live up to our standards about integrity, about facts, and, admit when you're wrong. It's just an essential part of this process. Other things too, put your name on something and don't believe anything if there isn't somebody's name on it and their reputation on the line in case it's wrong. And if it's wrong, it doesn't have to be a career ender. It's a knockdown a little bit, but they accept it and you move on. But there's a whole bunch of trends right now towards like, well, wouldn't it work if we just had anonymous science? And well, I don't know. I mean, we've got a couple hundred years of this thing that works, and some evidence that anonymity isn't turning out so well. So anyway, I think there's lots we can do to just maintain our internal standards and be patient. This is part of my view on this is you just got to be a long run guy. So I mean, 1 billion years, I can't get everybody excited about that, but a couple hundred,
So let me ask you a final question before we turn it over to the audience for questions. You've had, by any standards, a very unusual career trajectory. You began as an undergrad in physics, then switched to economics, went back to Chicago, your PhD work revolutionized the study of macroeconomics with your emphasis on technological innovations being endogenized. Then you became a tech entrepreneur yourself.
Yeah.
Then you moved to New York, got into urbanization. Yeah. There was a brief foray in the World Bank. What can you tell us about the way your career path is taken, and what would you like to share with us about?
Yeah. Well, let me just make one point, which I think is not well understood. There's a striking parallel between my career and Bill Nordhaus's, my co-winner. Bill worked on this, he had the same kind of naivete and worked on exactly the same problem I worked on as a PhD student. Like, okay, technology, we should understand something about this. People do it, let's figure it out. Bill's been very generous. What he said was, well, I was working on these problems that were too hard, and then Romer came along and he solved them. I don't actually think, in terms of like integrity and process and facts, I don't think that's what the facts show. I think what happened was Bill was making progress on a trajectory very much like the one I followed, but he wasn't getting reinforcement at that time. It just wasn't the right time. And so I just benefited from some luck of the timing. I was working on these nobody can predict the future, so I wasn't predicting what was coming. We're in the midst of the Volcker recession and the wake of stagflation. I was just looking at history and kind of sounded like the village idiot. Hey everybody, it's getting better and better. Why are you all so pessimistic? But then said the PC, gets introduced in like the year I take my first job, and the tech revolution takes off. So I just benefited from just sort of the timing in a way that nobody could have forecast. So it's related to this remark about you've got a role. The singling out somebody to play that role is much more determined by chance than I think we usually give it credit for. So, you don't want to overstate what any one individual does. Beyond that, I feel like, so I was lucky on the timing. I think I've just been lucky to have a little bit of that sense of imagination so that I could think about doing other things in a career. The typology that this political science at Princeton described was a kind of work that Niels Bohr does, and my growth theory was of that ilk. I sometimes used to call that Nobel Prize science. Bohr got one, and I got one too. But then there's Edison style work, which is very different, and but a lot of the benefit comes from the Edison work, and the stuff I did on like the education and technology, I think was similar to that. Then when I came here for the Marin Institute and went to the World Bank, it was all about trying to then take advantage of these benefits in this mixed area of Pasteur's quadrant, where Pasteur was working on the foundations of microbiology, but also things like how do we protect the vineyards in France? How do we keep the food that the French army carries from spoiling? So it wasn't a conscious strategy, but I ended up kind of traversing these three areas, and I think it would be good both individually and organizationally if we made it easier for people to make transitions. We don't lock people in. In some of the sciences now, it's much easier to go from, say, biology into like a startup, biotech startup. You can be on an advisory board. So this kind of iteration between the Bohr and Edison quadrants in some areas is easier. In social science, it's a lot tougher, and even the alternation between Bohr and Edison isn't quite the same as something like Pasteur. So I guess because it wasn't a trajectory, it was a conscious trajectory earlier in my career, but it became one when I was thinking about coming here to NYU and trying to create something new here in that Pasteur kind of vein. And it was part of the, it was part of the conjecture about going to the bank as well. And I wrote John Sexton a note because he sent me a nice email, and I kind of referred to the Marin Institute and the World Bank, and it's like, well, batting 500 is not so bad. And John's a baseball guy, so he liked that. That's where they have umpires, right?
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah.
So we'll turn it over for questions to the audience. I think we have another 15 odd minutes. There are people with mics, if any of you would like to ask any questions. There are hands in the back.
Good evening. Thank you. This insights are wonderful. My name is Ronald Pinto. I went to business school here.
Okay.
Graduated 10 years ago. I'd like to hear your opinion on, and I read this article in The Economist a few years ago. It talked about trends related to cities. Specifically in the US, that there's this trend that, we went through suburbanization back in the 50s and all kinds of studies, and there are stats out there that show that actually having strong city centers make us more competitive from an economics perspective.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your opinion on that. And aside from that, if we kind of know that and have the data, how is it that you see in other countries where they're kind of, I guess, behind the cycle, but you see that they're just catching up and beginning to think about this idea. So it's better to suburbanize if we already kind of know that that's probably not the right way to go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So another dear friend of mine, George Akerlof, who also got the Nobel Prize, but was a colleague at Berkeley, he and I, we wrote a paper that it was actually kind of fun that few people kind of know about the financial sector, which actually was a reflection of a kind of imagination, but actually a slightly darker one, which is like, okay, well, given the regulation that was available at the time, how could you really steal a whole bunch of money? And George came up with the title, Looting, the Economic Underworld of Bankruptcy for Profit. So the imagination kind of cuts two ways. But George had a saying that I loved that he picked up from railroad crossings in France. And the English version is, pay attention, one train may hide another. And it's a pretty good kind of thing to remind yourself every time you wonder what's going on. In this move to the suburbs, this return back to the city, I don't think this is fundamentally a story about urbanization. I think this is a story about law enforcement. And we had this trend in the United States where starting in the 1960s, crime went up very substantially, stayed high for a number of years, and then finally started to come back down. And New York City and Bill Bratton were really on the cutting edge of showing people that the police can actually do something about crime. For many years, people thought, your job was kind of like FEMA when there's a hurricane. You just show up and clean up afterwards, and you can't influence it. So we've had this big increase in crime, a high kind of level, and then this recognition that again, it's like technology. People can actually influence the crime rate. So I think that confuses some of the underlying dynamics, in the out to the suburbs, now back to the cities. I don't think that's a pure reflection of just the advantage of cities and density, but it's caused by, I think, it's a very interesting question. Lots of people have tried to ask, why has crime come down? But we really need a complete explanation of why did it go up? And then eventually come back down. And then to close the loop, we're back down at levels of crime, which are like those in the 1960s, but with much higher levels of incarceration. And so Angela and Mark are part of a program at the Urbanization Institute, where Marin Institute, where we paid attention to crime because it's a very important determinant of the quality of life. I used to tell John Sexton that who really turned around NYU? It was Bill Bratton. He gets credit, and just think about the value of the real estate in the portfolio here. If it weren't for the reduction in crime. I've heard this story about how much 1 Fifth Avenue sold for. I'm told it sold for $1 to $2 million.
Less than $1 million.
Yeah, less for the whole. I mean, every apartment is now more than $1 million. So anyway, that just gives you a way to calibrate how important crime might be, and it also is a story about the importance of management. Do you know what's the key to policing? So one key is, well, you have to get the police to do their job. Okay, and so that's part of it. But then what does it mean to do their job? You got a finite number of person hours. You've got some places where crime might happen. Put the person hours where the crime might happen. They call it cops on the dots. And CompStat and all that was just making sure you got cops on the dots. But it takes some management, insight and to actually carry that imperative out. But if you do it, you get a lot more benefit out of the given workforce. So this was part of the instinct that the management part of urban management would be important, and part of the conjecture about the synergy with the Stern School. So I think I've not really answered the question you were thinking I would answer, but my overall message is always ask yourself, what's the other train that I'm not thinking about when I see a unicausal explanation? And the other thing is use abstraction. That I think a lot of people don't think of the police chief as a management job. I think it's the hardest management job in the world. I mean, anybody here who's a manager, think about if your employees could use lethal force. Your direct reports, it's a pretty hard job. So I think that, the abstraction lets you see the commonalities between management, different layers, and then the kind of the open mind lets you see that there's often more than one thing going on.
Anybody else?
Somebody asked Woodrow Wilson, how long does it take you to write a speech? And he said, well, if it's a 10-minute speech, it takes me 2 weeks. If it's a 30-minute speech, it takes me 1 week. And if you want 2 hours, I'm ready now. So my answers to these questions are the 2-hour answers, I'm afraid. So, yeah.
The question there, Paul.
Wondering what your thought is in terms of what's the most challenging urban issue currently facing, could be domestically, could be globally, and what does it take to overcome that challenge?
Yeah. So, one abstraction concept that we get a lot of mileage out of in economics is efficiency. And we mean this in a precise sense, that there's a way that everybody could be better off, but somehow we're not realizing that. There's a really amazing inefficiency associated with this decision to either stake the public space that you'll use later to connect up with, or let development happen just in a completely unplanned way, and then try to go in and get this public space you need later. Haussmann in Paris did some of this, where they just bulldozed buildings and got the avenues, but it's politically almost impossible, and I don't think we'll ever see it again. So what we see around the world is a number of cities that say we're not going to have any growth, then they get growth anyway, which is totally disordered and unplanned. And then they come to organizations like the World Bank and say, we desperately need money to try and undertake these expensive retrofits of a sewer system in these unplanned areas. And what just kills you is the political dynamic there is always to get the bank to give money to do the retrofit in the area that is a mess. But there's never any attempt to say, let's just go put some stakes in the ground where the next round of development is going to happen. So it isn't this. So when we need the land to lay a sewer pipe, we've got it. The public authorities already have the land that you'll need to do any infrastructure. So I think that the inefficiency in this failure to plan and failure to literally just put stakes in the ground like they did here in New York. It was big steel or stone. These big stone posts in the intersections at the roads, or the trees like we're trying to do in Monteria. You can do this without even resolving the legal issues of title to the land and eminent domain. You just kind of set everybody's expectations. This is where the road that buses can drive on will be whenever we need it. I've taken to calling it Burning Man development, because it's just really like you just put stakes in the ground. You tell people you can't camp where where this public space is. You can go do anything you want, and the place that isn't public space. And that's about the level of planning you need. And the rate of return from just doing that is so high that it makes you almost want to cry. And this is why the work in like Huasa and in Colombia is so important, because it's one thing to say this idea, and Sully's been saying this idea, and Alain have been talking about things like this for decades, but showing it in practice has a value for convincing people that just talking about it in the abstract doesn't. So I think if we can get the whole world to start to think this way, that there's a way to have urban development take place, very like the way that New York City developed, if we can just get the world to think about that, then, 20 years, 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, the world will just be incredibly different. I mean, if you go look at Wall Street or Pine down in Lower Manhattan, see these crappy little ugly streets, and there'll be crappy little ugly streets in 100 years, in 500 years. We're never going to fix that, but it could all be like, Fifth Avenue and 42nd Street, buses, wide sidewalks, trees. I think people can't appreciate what an amazing difference it might make centuries into the future if we just did this simple thing of just putting stakes in the ground. We'll keep pushing on that.
Hi. Are there ideas that economists have embraced that the political class is kind of missing and just not adopting, but almost all smart people like you have supported? And if so, what are they?
Sorry, so are there ideas that...
Ideas that economists have embraced.
Have embraced,
have accepted, and this sort of unanimity, and yet the political class is either unwilling or too stupid to embrace them.
Well,
and give me one or two examples of them.
Yeah, my father was a politician, but politicians are not stupid by and large. They're very constrained by a process that they participate in. But I think we're just going to totally miss the boat if we start thinking that we're smart and they're stupid. The facts just don't justify that. And there may be some things that we've understood, like this urban expansion, public space. And to be honest, there's an enormous amount of work that needs to go into picking the names and the words for this. Urban expansion is starting to replace sprawl as the way people are talking about cities. And it's a huge mind shift to get everybody talking that way. I've been experimenting with this Burning Man idea because it is something that many people can see in their minds because they've seen pictures of this. It's also my answer when people ask me, well, how fast can cities grow? 70,000 people in a week. We've done it. So it's a solved problem. So that's basically the numbers for Burning Man. So we need to be always thinking about how do we communicate these ideas if our expertise has let us see something that others don't see. And I think this application to practical problems is an important part of sharpening our understanding and sharpening our ability to explain these ideas. The only other thing I can say is you got to keep an open mind. When I was a PhD student at the University of Chicago, I really couldn't conceive of the fact that I'd end up being in favor of government plans. And governments have to make a plan and go first. That's why I call it Burning Man, because it doesn't sound very, kind of Stalinist or something. It's light touch planning, but you gotta go with the flow. And if it really makes a huge difference to plan, sort of what I call a big, simple plan, if the facts persuade you that, you got to tell everybody, well, wait a minute, there is a role for government planning in this activity. It'll turn out a lot better if that happens. So as long as we can stay flexible and responsive to the facts, I think everybody else will eventually follow along.
So one last question. Rob? For those of you who don't know, our other Nobel laureate.
One of our other,
in the room. We are suffused with Nobel laureates in Stern.
This is going back a little bit more to the earlier version of this, but I mean, one of the things that I think I hear from you is that we're underinvesting in technology. And is there a way to make this a powerful point that can move some things forward?
If I'm thinking about watching my father try to work on problems, like a particular problem, like trying to improve educational systems, I'm really struck by how hard it is to communicate for us to somebody in that role, but for somebody in that role to then communicate to others. And we need to be mindful of the perceptions. So I've recently been invoking, I don't know, my girlfriend may shut this down, but up until now I've gone away with a car metaphor, which is, a lot of the thing is we need to step on the gas on innovation And I've been saying, what we really need to do is just a little bit of steering. Just take all of this amazing innovation that the markets and the governments do and just steer it in a slightly different direction. I say that partly because I've become more and more convinced that that's true, that there's huge differences in the rates of return, so a little bit of steering could make a big difference. I'll give an example in a second. But I also do it partly because I don't want to kind of echo the self-serving, we're professors, we're great, send us money, because it just doesn't sound credible. So even though I think that it would also be good to step on the gas, right now I think it would be wise for us all to think about the steering. And one example of this is the one that really is behind the prize association with global warming. One of the astonishing feats of imagination and discovery in the United States has been enhanced oil recovery, fracking. It's just incredible what has happened there. And it involves some things like the pipeline system that was kind of a common carrier. So small innovators, if they got more oil and gas, could plug into the analog of the highway system. So the government played a role in this. But a lot of individual entrepreneurship mattered too. That, as impressive as it was, and I just never believed when people said, we're going to get to energy independence in the United States. We've done it. It's actually not the kind of innovation we really need, because if we keep finding, we've lowered the cost at burning more and more carbon, it's like, oh, great. It's like, that's not the problem we're facing. So if we could steer a little bit of that innovation into, photovoltaics has been going like gangbusters, but there's still room there, wind, but the thing, I remember telling somebody like decades ago, we shouldn't have a space program. My son got really mad at me when I was I guess that's why I did it, but dissing NASA. We don't need a space program. We need a batteries program. It would just be incredibly influential if we had better batteries. So if we got more of this cleverness going in the direction of energy storage instead of fracking, people could still make money. It could be hugely beneficial, but it would also have consequences for the whole planet that would be certainly safer. So I think there's a lot of room to steer, and then we can come back and see about trying to get more room to step on the gas. Let me tell one other story, just because I love it. It's so unexpected. I'm in the school of the Communist Party in Beijing, and the meeting is about fracking. And there's some wet behind the ears young whippersnapper from DC who's kind of lecturing the Chinese officials about why they need to protect intellectual property better, more effectively. And a guy from Conoco leans over to me and says, you know why the Chinese are making so much, why their progress in fracking is so much slower than our progress in the United States? They have too much intellectual property protection. So I asked him, well, what do you mean? And he told me that in the United States, if you frack a well, the big issue is what combination of water, sand, and other things you put in your fluid. You have to publish what you used. There's some time lag, but it's not very long. You have to publish what you used and what the yield was. So many different firms and individuals who are doing this in an area can figure out for that local geology what's the combination of fluids that actually work. And it is the kind of example that I've used many times to say there's so much room to invent and discover, because if you find out how many different combinations of fluid can you make with a few ingredients and different ratios, and it's just this amazing number of possibilities. But in the United States, we force disclosure of what in many places you think of as a trade secret or something you'd patent. In China, they don't have patents, but it's a few big firms, and they just keep proprietary what they discover. So the message there is you can learn any place in the world, and you got to keep an open mind about our presumptions, because sometimes things turn out differently than we expect. Thanks.
So thank you, Paul. Thank you for a lovely conversation.